Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. I'm hosting this conversation from Chubuktuk, which is otherwise known as Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq, which is governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties. And as we enter into this exploration of knowing, it feels important to acknowledge the importance of naming these treaties, that we're all treaty people and that we have a responsibility to the land and to each other. And this is something that has too often gone unknown, in fact, has been discouraged from being known. And so may we all open ourselves to this knowing. So those of you who might not be familiar with me, my name is Brooke Thorndycraft, and I started a company called Big Waves that specializes in making the work that we do together to create change in the world feel better as we're doing it. And our focus is on relationships, and particularly in the area of connection, collaboration, communication, and conflict. And one of the things that we do at Big Waves is this series, Ripples and Rumbles. So this series is about subversion. And the dictionary definition of subversion is to turn from below. And at Big Waves, we yearn to turn things, and particularly the things that are getting in the way of collective liberation. And this feels particularly relevant to me in this moment, in which there are so many things going on that could really use some subversion in the world. And so we think about subversion and we think of below as places that are hidden and unspoken or taken for granted, or invisible, both inside ourselves and in our relationships and in our systems. And last year, in the first Ripples and Rumbles, we talked about subverting leadership, and it led us to want to go even deeper and more to the root of things. And one of the explorations we're most energized by is the exploration of knowing, of not knowing, and all of the realms related to this. And so what kinds of knowing are prioritized and reproduced? What kinds are ignored or silenced? How are our efforts to transform affected by what is known and what's not known? And this second round is a 5-part series. And so setting the stage first, we're going to be talking about the story of knowledge as we understand it today. And then we'll be moving on to consider less dominant forms of knowing, including outsiderness, edge work, disorientation, imagination, and sensual and embodied knowing. And we'll close in the last episode with a step back from knowing to actually look at being. And so for this first conversation in Ripples and Rumbles, Subverting Knowing, we thought we'd talk with someone who has studied knowing really closely to get a handle on just what is it that we're going to be talking about over the course of the series. And so I'd like to welcome Sofía Ortiz-Hinojosa, who graduated with a PhD in philosophy from MIT and began teaching at Vassar College in 2016. And she specializes in philosophy of psychology and psychopathology, epistemology, which is what we're going to talk about today, and Latin American philosophy. And she's the recipient of a Mellon New Directions Fellowship for 2023 to 2026 for her project entitled Mesoamerican Worldviews, How Indigenous Thought Influences Philosophy in Latin America. And in talking with us about Ripples and Rumbles and how she could help us open it, Sofía offered so many interesting topics and ideas that we thought about doing the whole series with her. How do we know what we know? Who decides that? How do we decide who decides? Is scientific knowledge better than spiritual knowledge or mystical knowledge? How can we disagree better? Why are so many mainstream scientists still dismissing Indigenous knowledge and what's resulting from that? And so many other things. We actually had such a hard time figuring out how to contain this conversation into an hour. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. And just before we get started, I'll make a quick note about participation, just to let you know a bit about how this is going to work today. We're recording this talk and we'll be sharing it afterwards. And because of this, we'll be asking participants to stay muted. But you're very welcome to put questions for Sofía in the chat, and we'll respond to as many as we can toward the end of the conversation. And if you need technical help with anything, you can message Joanne Kerrigan, who's waving right now. You can message her directly and she'll do whatever she can to support you with any tech needs. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And Sofía, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, totally. It's very exciting. So, as we just heard in my introduction, your work and scholarship is really quite wide-ranging. And we've really been enjoying the learning that we've done while exploring some of these ideas, both in conversation with you and in email exchanges. Um, but the initial way that we encountered your work was in our research for this series, specifically about knowing, and we came across your epistemology lectures that you have on YouTube. So maybe this is a good starting place for everyone. If I ask you to sort of explain what is, like explain what epistemology is, as if I was five, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, epistemology is a big word. It sounds kind of intimidating, but it has Greek roots, which is why it's a big word. Episteme is a word that means knowledge in Greek. So, epistemology is just the study of knowledge, and it's a big subfield in philosophy. We actually pack a lot into it that isn't only about knowledge. So, we also talk about other. We call them epistemic and doxastic states. So, doxastic meaning belief. So states like belief, like degrees of belief, and even things like perception, memory, and inferences. Like, how do those work? How do we get information from them? We also talk about the idea of justification or having a rational basis for your belief and like what does or doesn't give you justification. Like, what is evidence, for example? How do we know or how do we get information about what's true, right? And then we also talk about things like epistemic agents. So, like people who are knowers, those are epistemic agents. And also about epistemic agency, what's required to be the kind of person that uses or employs or assesses knowledge, right? Or testimony, right? What is it to know responsibly, to testify responsibly, to listen to others and like assess the information they're trying to give you, right? Also, who's an expert? How do you disagree with people? All of those are topics that are kind of subsumed under the discipline of epistemology.
Well, there's a lot there, and I kind of almost want to just ask a really can you just say a tiny little bit about this piece around epistemic agents, like just a little bit more around like what makes someone an agent or not?
Well, oh, that's a big question. So agency at its core, when philosophers talk about it, is usually about free will. It's about like whether you have the capacity to make decisions. So epistemic agency is kind of like you can kind of think of it as an extension of that. Like what is required for a kind of being or organism or a human, for example, to have the requisite capacities to know, right?
Mhm.
And to choose between what to believe or what not to believe, right? So all of these things that contribute to epistemic agency and philosophers debate what those are, right? So that's one of the topics too, is like, what is an epistemic agent? Um, some people talk about epistemic virtues. So you can have like epistemic humility is a virtue. Sometimes people talk about that's a good trait. You want to be somewhat doubtful about your own ability to know. And
Mhm.
skepticism is another element here, which I haven't talked about, but skepticism is like an attitude that maybe we can't know things. And most philosophers are not deep skeptics, but we talk about skepticism as like a foil for the thought that we know some stuff. Is like, to what extent is skepticism justified also?
That's awesome. Thank you. Like, I just feel like this is such an interesting, there's so many pieces of this that is just like endlessly, like we could go really deep into all of these pieces that you're bringing up. And I'm wondering if you could, just really sort of situate this in sort of why it matters, like in a
Yeah.
pragmatic sense, like what do we do with it? How do we experience it playing out in our lives?
Yeah, so I'll start with like the core of the question, which is like what kind of value does knowledge have? We can think of it on the one hand, which is a popular view, not everyone thinks it, that knowledge has internal value. We value knowing and we value these different kinds of epistemic states, like maybe wisdom, right, or understanding for their own sake. Like we want to know, we're curious, we're invested, we enjoy knowing for its own sake. But knowledge also has an instrumental value that almost everyone acknowledges. Like sometimes we want to know because it helps us do stuff or it helps
Mhm.
us figure out whether we can do stuff. It's a little bit like money, right? Money doesn't have intrinsic value, but it does have instrumental value. You can buy things with money. You can get experiences by exchanging them for money, right? Knowledge is a similar way. So, like, it can also help you feel secure and safe. Like, is this bridge the kind of bridge that I can get across without dying? Right? We
Mhm.
want information about that. That's an important survival thing. Um, it can also be about power, right? Knowledge can get you power, and not just in the trite kind of saying way, but in general, like people who are experts have a certain kind of social power for us. Like we need them, we look to them for guidance, we depend on them a certain amount, and that is a kind of power, right? Um, you can also share or withhold knowledge, right? And that's part of its value. It's not a good that you exchange in the way of like, I don't know, phones or money, but we can maybe think of the idea of imparting information and the information economy. People sometimes talk about it, right? Um, and also there's just the issue of why it matters is how are we sure that our beliefs and our epistemic agency and other things we care about are well founded, right? How do we know that the information we have coming at us is the right information, right? That they're in
Mm.
possession of the facts, right? Or who is in possession of the facts? And then also who depends on us, right? If we are supposed to know certain things, right? Um, and we don't, right? Like that's an issue, right? So who knows and how they know and how well they know and how well they're reporting on whether they know all of that stuff. Like, is someone lying to me? We care about all that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
totally. Yeah. So, I mean, something that you were like, something that we really think about a lot in our work at Big Waves, and also like just in what you were saying, you brought in this piece around sort of expert power, and that like there's really important ways that like really important roles that experts play in our lives and in the world. And then there's also sort of this other side of it, which is like, we part of our interest in this series really came about from thinking about what forms of knowledge tend to dominate and what kinds of knowledge tend to be left out, right? Or tend to not be considered expert in the same kind of way. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that around sort of how you would understand that from an epistemic lens.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there's lots of ways we could analyze this. So I'm because relations of power are at all levels. There's all kinds of historic and structural things that are affecting our ability to know. You can analyze this from a Marxist lens. I'm just going to talk about one thing for now because I find it a helpful framework for me in my academic sphere, which is this phenomenon called positivism, or at least sometimes called positivism. It's sort of with us nebulously, and once I start describing what it is, you'll be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense to me, right?
Yeah.
So one aspect of positivism, it was named by this philosopher and kind of the inventor of sociology, this guy named Auguste Comte. He's a French guy. That's sort of less important than what the view is. So he wanted positivism to be this whole system of how to construct a society that was, in his view, like a successful society. And it involves like hierarchies, including hierarchies of knowing. So like science is better than philosophy, which is better than religion. And in his view, societies progressed through kind of these mythical stages, from like the mythical stage to the philosophical stage to the scientific stage, which he called the positivist stage. So that the positive stage was the one you wanted to get to. That was the best kind. It's like humans are evolving. So there's an element of social Darwinism in there too. And when you append a kind of social Darwinism and like a scientific racism, you get people like Herbert Spencer, who was a positivist. They were in favor of things like eugenics because they thought, oh, well, if you keep all the unintelligent people, all the backwards people, all the people that are like in this mythical belief stage out of the population, you'll improve society or something. So overall, the view values progress as being science, progress as being utility.
Mhm.
And then it also certain epistemic states like observation is the way to know things by observation. You can't introspect stuff. Like you can't just look at the inside and know yourself. It's actually behavior that we want to look at. They also prioritized reason over other kinds of things like intuition or faith or instinct.
Mhm.
They valued being able to do things with math and statistics, right? Over testimony or opinion or even qualitative information, right? So there's all these elements to positivism. Um, and some of them are positive. Like some of those things are things we want to keep or that we actually do value. Like we do value observation, we do value science. But the system sort of hierarchically prioritizes some of those things and deprioritizes other things. And positivism has kind of shaped, even though it was a movement in the 1900s, actually, sorry, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it has shaped even our world today in the 21st century. And you can kind of see those values like playing out in social interactions, in the way that we organize our academic institutions, even in the way that we organize our workplaces, right? Like, how are people evaluated? That kind of stuff is informed by this hierarchy of what kind of information is good, right?
Yeah.
Presented in the right way. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I can even see the way that, like, thinking about it from a workplace perspective, the way that that plays out in terms of evaluation of credentials for hiring or things like that too, right? In terms of, what does it mean? What is the benchmark of knowing enough, being expert enough, having the right experience, all of those kinds of things. And it's sort of maybe moved a little bit away from this in certain sectors, but there's still such a focus on level of education, on how much can you prove that you know, all of these kinds of pieces. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Um, yeah. Okay. So I'm curious, something that comes up a lot in my work is the difficulties, thinking about that whole piece that I just kind of was speaking to. Something that comes up a lot in my work is the difficulties that people have with feedback, like both giving it and receiving it. And I feel like sort of my experience working with people around this is that some of this is really coming from what we learn in school or learn from our families about how horrible it is to be wrong, right? That it's like, um, in order to really demonstrate your worth, you have to demonstrate rightness, and you have to do that in certain ways and in certain formats. And so, I feel like there's some connections here as well to some of the complexities around expert culture and all of that. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that around some of these dynamics around kind of our beliefs about sort of knowledge expertness and what counts and what doesn't count, and maybe just like take us another layer deeper into that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I was just thinking as you were asking, like how positivism kind of frames some of this, like the feedback culture, right? It's very numeric, even for me, teacher evaluations, and that's part of what's terrifying, right? They're not really seeing what I'm doing; they're just seeing like the data or something, or like the background that I have. But expert culture and like these forms of assessment have its upsides and its downsides, right? Like on the one hand, it's really great to have experts because you want to have people that you can rely on. Like you want to have the person that you can go to help you fix your car, or like who knows how to like I don't know, fix your struggling company or your health, right? We
Yeah,
value
like
that
I
kind.
want a surgeon who knows how to be a surgeon, for example.
Right. Yeah, you
Yeah.
don't want some charlatan off the street who's selling you snake oil. That's all of our worst nightmares, right? But at the same time, it's got like these big negatives where it can be a form of control sometimes who is deemed to be an expert and who has the power or like the credibility to deem certain people experts. And part of what that expertise is, right? It's kind of a credibility thing. So sometimes in philosophy, you talk about a credibility gap. There's a credibility gap between different people in society. But I'll give you one example of like a pernicious example of expert culture. Not to throw him under the bus because I like Plato, but Plato in the Republic, he presents, it may or may not be his actual view, but he presents this republic, this ideal kind of society as being run by um, kind of an aristocratic class who like has all the knowledge and they have like all of these virtues. He thinks they're like the morally best people and the most knowledgeable people. And so they should be the ones in charge, which sounds great, except that he thinks that part of what is allowed because they know more than other people is to keep information from other people or even lie to other people in order to perpetuate this like perfect society. Sounds very dystopian to us in the 21st century, right? And that's so great. So we don't love that um as much anymore. And I think one thing that's worth considering is even without expert culture, you could still have inequalities. Like it's not like knowledge inequality is the only kind, right? Someone can prevent you from fixing your car, not because you don't know how to fix your car, because they have like all the resources. Like maybe they own all the tires and they don't want to sell you any or something. But I want to talk about one last thing. in this like sort of systems framework. So one thing I find really helpful is this book by Jose Medina, who's a Spanish philosopher, and he writes about how in our current democratic society, we often expect consensus as the result of deliberations and debate.
Mm.
And we need like to build this agreement idea. And so there's a sense in which expertise can make that feel bad, right? Because like someone has more knowledge than someone else. And so you're sort of relying on that person. And that's uncomfortable because in a democracy, we all want to be equal. But Melina says the problem is in part with the idea of the agreement, the consensus that is this like ideal end state that we need to reach. He thinks disagreement is valuable in and of itself. Like when we talk about feedback, like why is it useful to get other people's feedback? Why is it useful to get other people's bad reviews, right? It's because otherwise there's information that you're missing, right? That you don't have, or there's like, you get kind of stuck with the idea that we all have to agree about something. And then that system becomes broken and intractable because the people that are in it can no longer change it because the fear is more the fear of disagreement than, right? So disagreement is productive. He calls it like the friction with which we walk, right? So walk like epistemically. So you need sometimes to get that negative clashing. And for him, an ideal democracy is one in which we are able to bring up our disagreements and we are able to move forward that way, as opposed to one where we're always trying to get to a point where we all agree.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I'm all about disagreement. I love disagreement. But I mean, it's really not the way that we think about, like, I'm appreciating sort of how you're framing this as actually like knowing is about disagreeing. And how can you just even say just a tiny bit more about that? Like, I would love to know more about sort of his perspective on like, what is it that you get that is different from what we currently experience if we were more comfortable as a society with disagreement?
Well, I mean, I think there have been times as like in our current North American society where we have been more comfortable with disagreement.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can be really bad, right? Like where people can just say their opinion even if it's insensitive. Like that's hurtful. We don't love that. Insensitivity is not what we're looking for, but we are looking for an environment in which people don't feel paralyzed by the idea that maybe what I'll say is going to get me in trouble with other people, and so maybe I shouldn't say it at all, even if it's something they need to know or that I think would improve the situation for myself or for other people, right? Um, like no one wants to be the person to tell people the bad news that like things are going wrong, right? Either in a relationship, right, or at work, or with a whole like business structure, right? Like it's bad. It feels bad for us to share information that is going against the current belief structure in some context, but it can be really helpful. Like if you don't have that information, you can't fix the problem. And this is more of a relationship issue, but people talk about safe relationships, secure relationships are ones in which you feel comfortable sharing those discomforts and those disagreements. And I think like in a broader social context, I think that's also true. Like a safe place to be in a society or in a workplace should be one that allows for those clashes productively, right, respectfully, so that you don't lose out on all of those benefits of like what's in someone else's head, like what information do they have that I don't have, right? Equality kind of goes both ways there. Like on the one hand, maybe I'm wrong, right? And on the other hand, like we all need to know that we're all equally valuable. Like even in the expert case, sometimes experts miss stuff, right? And so
yeah, totally. This actually reminds me of there's some research that I read recently about surgical teams that were trying, like cardiac surgical teams that were trying to learn new technology that was really hard to implement, but if they were able to implement it, would have had like a massive change in terms of their success rate around heart surgeries. And there were multiple different teams that were trying to implement this, implement this new technology. And it was really the teams where, particularly the surgeon, but where the team generally was sort of like, we don't really know what we're doing here. We are going to bring as much expertise as we have, but we're also going to try things and trust each other and like not sort of get stuck in the sort of command and control kind of framework that a lot of surgical teams tend to be in. Those were the teams that were most successful at learning the new technology, and the teams that were more sort of focused on expert culture actually had a harder time implementing that new technology. So it's kind of like you can see where the expert culture is helpful, and then you can see where being open to disagreement and being open to sort of not knowing and exploring things and all of that. Yeah, anyway, I was just sort of thinking about that as you were.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah, you can look at public policy cases too. Like here in New York State, where I'm in, they were going to implement like a charge on people entering downtown Manhattan, which has been done in other big cities. And the governor backed out at the last minute, I guess, because she was worried that it was going to be unpopular. And like, I was slightly relieved because I don't live in New York City. It would be very expensive for me to go there, but it would have actually been better for the city. Like people would have been uncomfortable
Yeah.
for a while. They would have complained, but then they would have, figured out how to improve the system and gotten better. But like now we don't get the opportunity to do that hard work because sort of the whole thing has been abandoned, possibly because of bad public opinion. And yeah, I mean, you sort of wish like we could politically and otherwise handle discomfort better.
Yeah, totally. Well, and actually, that's interesting that you say that. Just sort of a last thought on this piece. Someone direct messaged me in the chat that I just happened to notice, and said that yes, and disagreement requires capacity. And I think that's exactly what you're mentioning there, right? Is that a big part of why it's so hard for us to disagree is that we actually don't collectively have the capacity to sort of move through the difficult feelings around that, the like all of the sort of challenges that come with that. So thank you for the chat comment as well. Okay, so I want to ask you a little bit more of a sort of specific in this moment kind of question that I've been thinking about a lot. We're, really living in a world that is increasingly polarized right now around what people think they know and what they believe to be true. And as someone who works a lot in conflict, I'm finding that it's actually becoming harder to support people to take other perspectives or to be curious about what they might not know in the context. And I'm curious how people who study knowing understand these moments of increased rigidity or of increased polarization around, like, for example, what kind of conversations have you been having around things like fake news or, sort of these sort of shifts in discourse over time?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. It's sort of where a lot of the exciting research is happening. And I think I'm going to try to restrict myself to a short answer for the sake of not going in every single direction. Feel free to ask questions about this later if you want. So on the positive side, all of these polarization phenomena are not new, right? We all have seen this happen before. Scholars have written about it before. Some of that is comforting, some of that is still worrisome. And one thing that I think has stuck in my mind when I think about these issues is there have been these research studies that have shown that people seem to have a way, a mechanism of knowing when their information and their outspoken beliefs are polarized. So in one sense, it's not as dire as we thought. In another sense, well, it is kind of bad, but it's bad for specific reasons. So it turns out if you give people a little bit of money, like we're talking cents, they are able to answer more accurately about the economic conditions that were present under either like someone who served on a party that they're in favor of or against. So like, right, we all bias kind of information to go toward whatever is politically or socially expedient for us. And so what that shows is if you offer people money, like they're sort of tracking the way in which the direction in which they're polarizing, and they're sort of able to correct for that somewhat. So speech, the way that we testify, the way that we give information isn't just about transmitting information. It's about also kind of mapping out where we are in our social identity, who we're allied with, who we want to get along with, who we want us to think of as like good people, trustworthy people, safe people. So when I talk about like the economy under X president or whatever, even when I'm only in a research context, like there is an element to everything that I'm saying that is informed by my social context. That doesn't go
Mhm.
away, right? You can't fully erase that. I'm always a social being. And so it's a negative thing in that it means that polarization is a kind of groupthink where like I want to belong to this group, so I'm going to say whatever they think is good for me to say. But there's another good element, which is that that doesn't completely overwhelm our rational capacities, right? We're
Mhm.
all kind of a little bit aware of the way in which we might actually disagree with or like have other information than the one that's like the party line, for example.
Mhm.
Uh, but we don't always express that because it's not socially safe for us to do it, right? So we come back to
Yeah.
the issue of safety.
Yeah,
Um,
totally. Oh my goodness. Sorry, were you about to say something else? Because I just had a
no,
uh,
this is good. Jump in. Yeah.
yeah, I'm thinking about we just recently watched a documentary from, quite a while ago now by Adam Curtis called Century of the Self. And one of the things that they were talking about in that documentary was how polling it particularly in the sort of Reagan Thatcher area, this is where they were looking specifically at it, or era, that polling was so dramatically wrong because people were embarrassed to say how they were really going to vote, because how they were really going to vote was very self-interested, and they were sort of in a context where it wasn't quite acceptable to be as self-interested as the way that people were voting. And so it wasn't expected that Reagan and Thatcher were going to be elected by as much of a margin as they were, because the polling was demonstrating that people were considering social context more than they actually were when it came time to vote. So it's interesting to think about that sort of that belonging piece. And in that moment, it's in a particular direction, but that the sort of like the belonging, the social identity, the wanting to make sure that you're saying or presenting yourself in the way that aligns with that group identity is super interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, could have more examples, but I also don't want to swamp um
Yeah,
the
for sure.
yeah.
Um, so, I mean, we've been talking about this a little bit. And, there's sort of the saying, knowledge is power. And you did talk about this initially, about sort of the way that power plays out in terms of some of these things. But I'm wondering if you could go into a bit more sort of detail around how you would think about that from an epistemic perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, I want to preface this by saying like power can sound kind of like a bad word, right? Like that's what it sounded like to me for the longest time. I was like, oh, power is obviously a bad thing. Like anybody who wants power is like a bad person. But no, I mean, actually, insofar as you think about power as something that like allows you control over your environment and your own destiny, right? We
Yeah.
all want a certain degree of power, at least minimally over ourselves. We want to be empowered to make our own decisions. And sometimes it can help us too to have a little bit of control over our environment and not just ourselves, right? Because other people affect us. So insofar as like the dimension of power is there, we all sort of are invested in getting a little more power than we have, right? It can be something as obvious as like we all want to be paid a little bit more, or something as less obvious as like, well, we are all kind of wanting either to be left alone more or the ability and power to get other people to do what we want. Um, can get really nefarious, right? In the big scale. So knowledge being one of those things that allows us to do things and gives us control over things in that sort of power is incredibly important. And one of the ways in which you can see sort of power struggles happen interpersonally on an epistemic scale is like when we think about disagreement, right? If you think one thing is true and I think a different thing is true, but we have the same information in front of us. So that's what we call being an epistemic peer. You and I have the same or similar
Mm-hmm.
capacities and the same information, but we come to different conclusions. Like, what's going on there? Epistemologists want to know, like, what's the right thing to do? Should
Yeah.
we move our opinions or beliefs more toward each other, or should we stay where we are? That's a debate that epistemologists have, and there are lots of reasons for one and the other side. Like, on the one hand, it can be good to conciliate, that is, move our opinion together because it shows that we have epistemic humility, which is a good thing, right? We might be wrong. It acknowledges that we might be wrong. On the other hand, it can also be bad because some people argue that it's double counting your evidence. Like we've already got the information, and now I'm adding this additional piece of information that someone thinks on that basis that a different thing than me. That's kind of meta information. That's not this information. Um, and the other reason that some people think that conciliating can be bad is if I'm at an epistemic disadvantage or a social disadvantage where uh, I tend not to be taken seriously, and I'm inclined to always conciliate, that's going to end up with a situation where I'm always the one compromising on my beliefs, right? And so some people say, well, I should hold on to my own opinion, sometimes especially when I'm disadvantaged, because nobody else is going to do it for me. Like I need to stand up for myself, right? That's kind of the epistemic equivalent. So another way in which knowledge as power is kind of an important issue. We can talk about, like Charles Mills has a book where he talks about white ignorance as like a phenomenon, and white ignorance is like an active thing in his opinion. So like uh, information is actively suppressed by certain people in power because they don't want to be otherwise disempowered or disenfranchised in ways that they're used to, or like they don't want to lose their privilege. To give one historic example, there was this thing called Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, and it was burnt down. And it was like a moment of economic prosperity for like this Black population. And you almost never hear about it, right? Unless you're in the know, unless you're in one of those communities that has the community knowledge, you're not going to learn about it. You're not going to learn about it in a classroom. And sometimes even if you visit the sites where these horrible things happen, where these discriminations happen, you won't see information about it because it's not convenient to those who actually have power right now to disseminate information about things that that community has done in the past that's bad, right? If you go to the Alamo right now, it's probably not going to talk about Indigenous people, for example. So there's a way to empower ourselves by altering or reappropriating concepts that have been put down. So like, for example, disability pride is a concept that I like. It's similar to like gay pride. You know, disabilities are thought of as like this inherently negative thing. And so how can you be proud of having a disability? That's part of the transformative power of this. We call it conceptual engineering. This concept has been re-engineered, right, taken up again, reappropriated by a more ameliorative, let's say, perspective where actually being a disabled person can be a happy experience. Like there are wonderful, flourishing ways to live a life with a disability. And so the concept of disability pride helps us take back that kind of enforced disempowerment that is inherent in our concepts, even not just in the information we distribute or how we educate people, but sometimes also just in the very idea of how we interpret meaning. Sorry, that was a lot, but
Yeah, no, I love that. That's super helpful. Thank you. I mean, yeah, I think I can imagine that there might be some questions from people around what you were talking about as well, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. I wanted to, I think like we've been sort of talking in a range of different ways around sort of knowledge and power and what kind of knowledge is recognized and what kinds of knowledges are not as recognized, or, sort of what you were just talking about around conciliating and humility and all of those kinds of pieces. And so I'm wondering, can you speak to a little bit some of the ways that what comes to be dominant in terms of knowing, or like epistemic sort of understanding, maybe affecting society's abilities to move toward more liberatory goals?
yeah. So one really good example that I think speaks to kind of how you open the session is the idea of indigenous knowledges and how they're disadvantaged, like throughout like the North American hemisphere, right? So so you can see sort of how we've confused, we here as the big we, the general societal sense, have confused Western scientific expertise with complete and total knowledge of the universe. right? There's lots of things that science can get us. I love science. I wanted to be a scientist when I was younger, and I just fell in love with philosophy. So I started doing other things. Like one of the reasons I'm doing philosophy is because I love knowledge. Like I want to know all the things. That's a good endeavor. But this totalizing view that there's this one method that you can use to learn everything about everything is misleading and can disadvantage groups that hadn't already been included in that method or in that way of doing things, right? I'm not just talking about the fact that there aren't more Indigenous people's bodies in our scientific, like academic spaces, but also the idea that the knowledge that these communities have harbored and brought forward for a long time hasn't been privileged and mostly hasn't been listened to. So a little epistemic humility can go a long way, and a pluralistic attitude to building knowledge can help us all in our various human endeavors. I think I can close with one example that I'm just really fixated on because I think it's like tragic and hilarious at the same time. In the Pacific Northwest of the United States and I guess like southwestern Canada, there are these places that traditionally it have been called old growth forests, where people thought this is like untouched wilderness. Like this is just nature, like somehow untouched by man, this sort of like dichotomy of human and nature. Um, and it turns out that view is totally wrong, because indigenous groups had been there for a long time and had actually like heavily altered the ecosystem there, not in an unsustainable way. Like they altered it sustainably so that that ecosystem at every level of the biosphere, like the canopy level and at the like shrub level and at the like subfloor level, they had populated those forests with edible foods and medicinal herbs and like things that were useful to the indigenous groups that lived there. And that kind of stewardship, you can see throughout, right, the world, like where humans have been altering their environment everywhere, but because of this colonial situation and this like complete lack of knowledge that the settlers came in with, like they didn't see that. They saw wilderness, and it took hundreds of years for like the powers that be to start acknowledging that that
Yeah.
was true, right? And like how differently we would live and we would eat and we would move through the world if we had that knowledge at the outset. And I think it's a tragedy, not just for the groups that have been so heavily disadvantaged, but all of us that have lost out on the ways in which those knowledges could have helped us, right? That's a
Yeah.
small example and also a huge example, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's, yeah. And then it's just, yeah. That is, yes. Um, Such a huge example. Thank you for sharing that. Um, so I want to leave some time for people to ask questions if there's anything that Sofía has shared that you're sitting with or that you want to know more about, or something about knowing that is sort of, going on a diversion. Any questions that anyone has, and you're welcome to write those in the chat. Or also, if you want to, just be aware that we're recording, but if you want to, you can actually ask your question live if you would like. So whichever you prefer, either writing it in the chat or if you want to, put up a hand and unmute and ask it live, you're totally welcome to do that as well. I'll just pause here for a minute.
oh, okay. I'm back, I think.
Did you disappear?
Yeah, you all froze for me for a minute, which I think meant that I was frozen for a minute.
Oh, well, you're back.
Good, good, good. Yeah, and feel free to take your time, everybody. These are like
Yeah, this is a
these are
lot
big
of,
issues. So. I also want to say if folks want to, uh, you can also ask general questions about the discipline of philosophy if there's anything you've ever been curious about. I know, kind of a strange subject. I mean, a perennial one, but if you have questions about that, about what we do, our methodology, anything like that, feel free.
So, so I'm just thinking about, I didn't want to take up too much more time in case people did have questions, but I will just sort of maybe follow up on what you were saying around sort of the cultivated forests, the stewarded forests. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more to like how else do you see that showing up? Like in terms of the ways that knowledge is either encouraged and supported or sort of kept uh,
Yeah.
not prioritized.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you start thinking about it, on your own, you'll start thinking of millions of
Yeah,
examples, like women's healthcare. Like,
yeah.
as a recent new mom, even with a woman who was treating me, like, there's all these like medical ideas, medicalized understandings of how women should give birth, and if you studied a little bit, oh, that wasn't always the case, or like it varies country to country. All these like very like regionally specific ways that we do things
Yeah.
in those regions present as like the only way to do them. And that's kind of surprising if you take the long view. But it can also tell us something about ourselves, I think. I think that we take comfort in having like dominant narratives, including ones that are like the countercultural ones. I think we take comfort, like right there's like a dichotomy. There's like, oh, there's like what the majority of people think, and I'm one of those people who's not in the majority. That can also feel empowering, and that dynamic is useful because it sort of keeps things churning. But I think that sometimes that comfort that we feel in like thinking that we're the ones who have the truth
Hmm.
can be the most, not always, but it can be the most pernicious thing in some contexts, because of how it, I don't want to use the wrong word, how it removes from view
Yeah.
things that would otherwise be in view and are really obvious. Like sometimes in these like revolutionary moments in society, people look back and are like, oh, why didn't people know that? Wasn't that kind of obvious? Like, why did no one do X or Y? Like, it's so clear. Like, going back to women's healthcare, there was this one period in human history that was devastating, even more devastating than recent years for women's health, where doctors used to go from the morgue to helping women give birth without washing their hands because germ theory wasn't widely accepted, right? Germs are these tiny little unobservable things. It sounded crazy to believe in them. What do you mean they just float in the air? Like, that sounds crazy sauce. If you need proof, right? Like and so all these women and babies were dying because they got infected with diseases from dead corpses, right? Like,
Yeah.
and women would go into hospitals and it was just like the death rate was exceedingly high, like 30% or something of women died in childbirth because of infection. And like, yeah, looking back, you're like, that was insane. Why did we do that as a society? And then also, like, in the past, looking forward at that time, if you were a midwife, you'd probably think to yourself, well, that sounds nutso, right? But again, it's just these moments where we get into the hubris of believing like that this new helpful explanation, like medicine is incredible. It's gotten us so many amazing things. I have doctors in my family, so who would I be to hate on med? Like, it's lengthened our lifespans, it's increased our quality of life, it's done all these things. But that moment of excitement, oh, we have this new thing, it can
Hmm.
sometimes hobble us too because we get overconfident and think
Yeah.
we figured it out for all time or something. And it takes those voices to kind of get us back down to earth and be like, this isn't going to be a panacea. Also, there's all these elements, right? We always need to be kind of scanning around our environment and just checking, right? That's where the disagreement comes in. It's the ability to sort of check in. There are these philosophers who call it an exercise in cognitive hygiene. It's like washing your hands, but you're washing your epistemic faculties, like your perception, your memory, your reasoning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's exactly, yeah. It's like, right. It's the piece of, like it sort of hit me when you were saying that about the sort of the confidence, the certainty, it's that quest for certainty or that excitement about feeling certain about something that actually just gets us as humans into so many problems in so many parts of our lives, right? So I'm really appreciating that example. So there is a question.
Mhm.
With the discussion about thinking, which I think of being viewed from a cognitive lens, is there physical, emotional, or spiritual ways of thinking in philosophy? That's such an interesting question. Thank you for that, Carolyn.
So what were those three things? Spiritual, emotional, and
Physical, emotional, or spiritual ways of thinking.
yeah, there are. And I mean, this isn't exclusive to philosophy. Philosophy is just kind of like, in some sense, it's the receptacle of all the theories. So we debate with each other about which theory to adopt, right? But there are definitely with this new movement in embodied cognition, which is it's sort of in its popular peak right now. It's trendy, for good reason. Um, People have in cognitive science and philosophy of mind started questioning whether everything is sort of located in the brain, right? Whether all thinking is happening like up here. Maybe some of our thinking is embodied, for example, it's in our physical whole being or something like that. Maybe some of it is emotional. And what if your emotions aren't just like a bunch of chemicals churning around your brain, right? Maybe your emotions are also like hormonal, like, and those are all over your body. Maybe you need, right? Do you feel emotions differently if you have a different kind of body than someone else? Like all of those things are super interesting. There are ways that we're thinking about it now. And sometimes there is a spiritual aspect, like there are people both historically and now, like in all kinds of traditions, who think of modes of thinking that are not accessible in a conceptual way. Let's put it that way. That's another way of thinking it. Like there's this non-conceptual thought some people talk about. Not everyone frames it in those terms, but that's the case in like South Asian philosophy and sometimes in medieval, like Islamic and Christian philosophy and theology, right? And even Jewish theology sometimes. Uh, so yeah, so all of these like alternative modes, not only of knowing, but also of thinking, are things that we can explore and think about. And like, is that the right framework? Is that the wrong framework? I like to think that, because I'm one of those philosophers who doesn't pick a spot. I like to think that there's a little bit of truth in all of those views. I think that our brain is incredibly important, does a lot of stuff for us, but I also think it's not going to be the repository of everything that explains why we believe what we believe or how we do our reasoning. Like we can talk about intuition, and we talk about intuition a lot in philosophy. And that's a funny thing. Some people really don't like it, including in philosophy, because it sounds vague. Like what's intuition? But mathematicians talk about intuition too. They talk about the mathematical intuition, like the sense that you sort of know that a proof is going to work, but you haven't proved it yet. Like, how do we do that? That's just kind of bananas, right? Like, is our unconscious, whatever it is, just like kind of generating information that floats up to our conscious surface? But where is that unconscious stuff happening? Maybe it's not all brain, right?
Yeah. Lots of people
Yeah.
talk about the gut as, and not just in that sort of like gut knowing kind of way, but that actually there's a whole lot of cognition that's happening in like the nervous system, in the gut, in like many different elements of our bodies,
Yeah, that
and
affects our decision making and our
possibly
taste.
beyond as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you take the big picture, we're not a single organism. We might be like a collection of lots of organisms, which is another whole fun thing to think.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
what is this consciousness that we have? uh, are we Borg, right? Like,
Totally. What is my gut bacteria telling me that I think is my own knowing or whatever? For sure.
mhm.
Um, okay, well, this is amazing. And thank you so much. And actually, this really sets up this last question really sets us up so beautifully for some of the next conversations that we're going to be having as well. So, I'll just say really quickly about that. And then I want to thank you so much for being here. That for anyone who's interested in joining us for the next conversation, I'm going to be interviewing Kai Cheng Tom on September 11th at 12 o'clock Atlantic time and 11 o'clock Eastern time on the topic of knowing from the edges and sort of from the shadows. And I hope you will join us for that. And if you want to, and then there's another one coming up off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact date, but in November with Sage Hayes. And we're going to be specifically talking about embodied knowing in that one. So, and then down the road, it's imagination and disorientation, and then moving beyond. I think some of the piece around spiritual knowing, feels connected to some of what we might be talking about in the conversation around being, right? So moving beyond this concept of kind of like conceptually knowing in that way. And what is it to just actually be with it, all of it. So anyway, if you're interested in any of these topics that are coming up, I hope you'll join us. And if you want to make sure to find out about when registration is open, you can sign up for our mailing list. Joanne has put it in the chat. And I just want to say thank you so much, Sofía. This has been I have really appreciated. I remember when we first sent you some questions for you to reflect on for this conversation, the answers that you sent back were just like, okay, this is going to be really interesting. And it has been very interesting. And I think has just beautifully set the stage for this series. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. And yeah, it's been really lovely. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming.
It's been so fun, and I love talking about any and all of these topics. So if anyone has follow-up questions that they think of later, or that they've maybe felt a little too intimidated to ask now, feel free to send them my email, and you guys can email me. Sometimes I'll take a little while to respond because I have a 2-year-old and her summer childcare is ending soon, but I will get back to you. I will get back to you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us here.
Thank you so much, everybody.